January 2018, in an interview with reporter Kathy Newman, clinical psychologist and university professor Dr. Jordan Peterson, you might have run across his stuff before, we got into a fairly heated debate over his view of the Canadian government's overreach in limiting free speech. At least that's what he was arguing in this interview. And during their dialogue back and forth, Dr. Peterson said to his interview, quote, "In order to be able to think, you have to be willing to be offensive. In essence, you have to be willing to say something that might make the person that you're talking to feel uncomfortable or challenged or even flat out wrong. And in turn, you're going to want to be able to grow and mature in your thinking. You've got to be willing to listen to somebody who's going to challenge how you think, which has the very high potential of making you feel a little bit uncomfortable or maybe even offended. For some reason in our culture right now, there is a growing movement of people who are trying to shut down anybody that they disagree with by calling for their opponents to be canceled or fired or worse, even physically harmed, instead of just engaging with them in conversation or debate so that everybody can understand their position, right? So that we can all learn and grow like adults. Kind of a crazy thought, right? And while this has been a slowly growing trend in our country over the last few years, it's actually not something that's new to humanity. In fact, it's one of the pretty typical responses that we have anytime that we get challenged in our beliefs, or if we find out that somebody's spouting ideas that offend us. You get offended often? I don't, thankfully. But if you hang out with a middle school kid and you mention that you don't like Star Wars or that you think the Marvel Cinematic Universe is overrated, or maybe if you tell your neighbor who flies their Seahawks flag every single day that, man, if we had as many polling stations in the US as the yards that the Seahawks have allowed on their defense, voting would be done by 10 a.m. You will find out exactly what I'm talking about. Or here's a fun experiment. Maybe make any sort of political statement on Facebook or Twitter or any of these social media sites and maybe just see what happens. But if you really want to see what gets people riled up, if you want to see people just go nuts, try undermining their very understanding of God. Chip away at their religion and the ancient traditions that have seen their people through some of the most desperate and brutal times of any people group ever. When you start to do that, even if you're helping them better understand the God that they're trying desperately to worship, I'm going to tell you what, it's likely that you're going to get some backlash. Maybe even a little bit more than backlash. Tonight, we're going to be tackling the first of two of what I consider to be the most offensively challenging things that Jesus ever said. And next week, we're going to wrap up this series with the second one of these two. Now, to set the scene for us, I'd like you to open your Bibles to the Gospel of John. We're going to be in chapter 14 tonight, which has us finding the disciples with Jesus in the upper room. But before we get to this cancel-worthy statement of Jesus's, we need to go back a chapter. We need to kind of get a sense of the atmosphere that these words were said into, because when we pull verses out of Scripture, right, without knowing where they came from and what was going on, all of the things that were happening in and around that time frame, we lose so much of what was meant to be carried with that verse. So, what's going on here in John chapter 13 is Jesus understanding that his ministry was coming to a close. His time on earth was just about over. Here's verse 1 of John chapter 13. Where am I at? Lost it. Hold on one second. We're going to get there together. Give you a little bit of extra time as you find your place. John 13:1. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and to return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything that he had come, and that he had come from God and would return to God. This is a pivotal moment for Jesus. Everything that he had been doing throughout his entire ministry, all of the miracles, the healings, the teachings that he had done, were all pointing towards a truth that really up until this point, he hadn't allowed to get out into the public yet. The people who saw him preach knew that he was different from the other teachers of the scriptures and all of these religious leaders that they had become accustomed to as they'd grown up, right? But Jesus taught like somebody with actual authority, not just somebody who was regurgitating the usual lines that they were told to repeat. And Jesus, when he healed, it was obvious that there was something incredibly powerful that was working through Jesus. Even more so than even the prophets that they had heard about, that they had learned about as they were growing up and hearing about all these stories from what we now consider to be the Old Testament. Even now, when they went to the temple to hear the scrolls read out loud, Jesus was doing far above and beyond what they were hearing in the scriptures, what they had expected that a man of God should be able to do. Jesus was blowing all of that out of the water, raising people from the dead, bringing back sight. All of it was pointing towards this underlying truth that Jesus had up to this point in the upper room tried to keep on the down low. In fact, we see him specifically commanding that his identity not be shared after doing these incredible acts. The first one is in Mark chapter 1, verse 24, as Jesus is healing this man from a demon possession. And the demon tells Jesus, this is what the demon says to Jesus, quote, "Why are you interfering with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus, in that moment, he commands the demon to stay quiet. And then after he commands it to leave this guy, the crowd marvels at Jesus' authority, even over demons, as if it wasn't something that they had ever seen before. This was a whole new level. And just a little further along in the first chapter of Mark, we see Jesus healing this man from leprosy. And then immediately, he tells this guy, stay quiet about how you've been cured. Kind of bizarre, right? Wouldn't he want everybody to know who he was? And when he raises this 12-year-old girl from the dead in Mark chapter 5, Jesus tells the girl's parents, don't tell anybody what's happened. Oh, and make her something to eat. She's probably pretty hungry. And again, when he heals this deaf man, he tells the people who are gathered around who see this thing happen, don't say anything about it, even though they do it anyway. And then again, in Mark 8, after healing the blind man, Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And when Peter says, hey, you know what? They're actually saying that you are the Messiah. Jesus tells his disciples not to tell anybody who he is. Over and over and over again, we see Jesus being Jesus, healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons. Over and over again, we then see him telling people, don't let this get out. Don't let the world know who I am. It's kind of bizarre. And as the disciples gather together to celebrate this Passover meal, right? Not knowing that this would be a moment that the world would look back on as pivotal to all of civilization. Jesus is at the point where he's understanding that his time is just about over. And as Gandalf would say in Return of the King, the board is set and the pieces are moving. All of the things that have been happening behind the scenes, they're about to come together over the next few hours. And so Jesus gives one last object lesson to his guys, right? He takes off his outer tunic, he bends down with his towel and he begins to wash their feet, teaching them about what leadership looks like in the kingdom of God. It's not like you guys are thinking, let me show you one more time. And then Judas gets called out for what he's about to do, and he takes off to finish setting up this betrayal with the Pharisees, right? That he's probably hoping will bring about this military revolution, but doesn't. Jesus then predicts his own death, and Peter boldly claims that, man, Jesus, I'll die for you. And Jesus kind of shuts him down hard and tells him that he's going to actually end up denying he even knows Jesus by the time this is all over. It's this really heavy moment. The atmosphere is thick with tension, and the disciples have heavy hearts. You can almost feel the anticipation of some huge unknown event that's closing in fast on the disciples, even though they don't know what it is. We're 2,000 years removed from this moment, but you can kind of feel the tension, the weight, right? And that's when chapter 14 starts off with the words of Jesus. This is what he says. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust in me also. There's more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I'll come and get you, so that you'll always be with me where I am. And you know the way to where I'm going. No, we don't, Lord, Thomas says. We have no idea where you're going, so how can we know the way? In verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. If you had really known me, you would know who my Father is. From now on, you do know him, and you've seen him. And Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. And Jesus replies, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and yet you still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So why are you asking me to show it to you? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I speak are not my own, but my Father who lives in me does his work through me. This is the conversation that would define for these men the reality of who Jesus is. But that wouldn't actually happen until after the resurrection, when they began to process everything that they had seen and heard through a completely different lens. The lens of the cross and the lens of the resurrection. It's not that they didn't hear Jesus' words for the first time. They did. But when you witness something that shifts your perspective on life itself, you tend to go back and re-examine the things that you were pretty sure you knew at the time, but now everything's kind of up in the air. And this is one of those conversations that they would go back and rehash with this new information. And there are two massive claims that Jesus makes at this moment in the upper room. This phrase that we've become so familiar with was highly provocative and absolutely, without a doubt, heresy. It's the phrase, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And without parsing out this entire phrase in the Greek and what it meant in the Hebrew and all of that kind of stuff, there's some pretty huge implications that the disciples would have picked up on that night, even if they didn't fully understand all of it until after Jesus' resurrection. The first thing that would have caught their attention is Jesus' use of this phrase, I am. Because not only does this harken back to this title that God uses for God's self when Moses encounters the burning bush, which, frankly is a massive claim for Jesus to make right here. But it's also a pretty bold phrase to use in Greek, which is most likely what Jesus was speaking. At least it's what John was writing in. It would be like somebody making the claim that, quote, I myself and only I, right? But we're going to spend all next week talking about this. So we're going to jump past this for now. But we'll get to it next week, don't worry. The question is, what does Jesus mean by the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me? Well, Jesus is answering, in a very Jesus-like way, the question that Thomas asked him right? This question, we have no idea where you're going, so how can we know the way, Jesus? Like, you're talking about this thing, but we don't get it. And his answer? Follow me. It was the call that had gotten all of them from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, right? Following in his footsteps is the way to the Father. Acting like him, treating people like he treated people, seeing people like Jesus saw them, becoming little Jesuses is the way that you come to the Father. Jesus is the person that you model your life after, the kind of life that you live, and the person that you become that leads you to the heart of God. He is the way. And he also claims to be the truth. Not just to speak the truth sometimes or to teach the truth when he's being serious, but to be the truth. If you go back and you read through the Psalms, you'll read the authors say that God's law is the truth. But as we talked about last week, Jesus had been taking what people knew to be God's truth and advancing it, right? Taking it to the next level, fulfilling it, taking it to beyond what they had ever considered. He claims that it's not the law that's the truth, or somebody's interpretation of the law, or what you've heard that the law says, but actually that he is the truth. Everything that he does, all of the things that he says, the way that he acts with people, how he speaks to them, Jesus is the truth of God. And he also claims that he's life. That in him true life is found and lived out. Not the life that everybody's currently living, not life in survival mode, not a life just kind of coasting on autopilot, awaiting the next thing on the calendar, but life as it was intended. Life to the fullest, a life lived as Jesus lived his life, constantly looking for ways to love the people around him, looking to serve those who needed him, looking to show the love of God in every single action. His life is what life is supposed to look like. The kind of life that we're called to be striving for and emulating. Jesus claims that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And it doesn't really catch us off guard as it should. His claim insists that we can't find the way without him. That we can't know truth without him, that we cannot live life as it should be lived without Jesus. He takes our current culture's claims that we can find true meaning and purpose and truth if we just look inside ourselves. It's been in there the whole time. It takes those claims and it throws them in the trash where they belong. Jesus tells his disciples straight up that nobody comes to the Father except through me. And frankly, I can't think of a more offensive statement than that, especially in our culture right now, that there's one way to God. But the good news of the gospel is that the way, the truth, and the life isn't constrictive, it's actually beautiful. It's the kind of way that we want our kids to walk in. It's the kind of truth that calls all of us to love more. And it's the kind of life that simply becomes magnetic because of its fruit. The fruit of the Spirit, love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness and gentleness. A life that's faithful, full of self-control. And so this week, as you head back out into the world that God has placed you in, however it looks, may you follow the way of Jesus. May you walk the path of Christ and live the truth that is Jesus.